Hi, everybody. I am Sasha Rosenbaum. I'm a product manager here at GitHub, and it is my absolute pleasure today to host a panel on managing boundaries, balance, and funding in open source. If you've been watching GitHub Universe sessions today and the previous couple of days, you know that the world is largely powered by open source. But you also know that open source is not necessarily easy to get started with or easy to get into, manage, and so on and so forth. So I may be biased, but I think whether you're just getting started or you already have a big project and you're looking to get it funded, or you're just looking to figure out how to have work-life balance in open source, this panel is for you. And here we're talking with some really great open source maintainers, Gina, Evan Yo, and Wes McKinney. And these discussions actually started with the GitHub README project, where we learned a little bit about each of the maintainers and had a privilege to hear some of their stories. And we just wanted to bring it out over to you. And you can also look it up at github.com/readme to read more about each one of our panelists. So with that, I will let my panelists introduce themselves. So Gina, why don't we start with you?
Hi, I'm Gina, aka Fusel on the net. I would classify myself as a full-blood nerd. I'm also a full-time OSS maintainer now since 2014, and I'm also a gamer and hobby baker. Back to you, Sasha.
Nice. All right. So Evan, let's continue the intros.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Evan Yo, and I'm also an independent open source developer. I work on the front-end JavaScript framework called Vue.js, and I've been doing it full-time since 2016. Back to you, Sasha.
Awesome. And Wes, why don't we continue introductions?
Hi, I'm Wes McKinney. I'm best known as the creator of the Python Pandas project. Over the last several years, I've been focused on the Apache Arrow project, and I currently direct Ursa Labs, which is a group of six full-time Apache Arrow developers.
Thank you, Wes. So my first question is actually, what would you describe your role as open source maintainer? And Gina, let's get us started.
I would say it's like a bit of a mixture of being a gardener, a parent, and an architect at the same time. On the one hand, you have to take care of your code and make sure it grows and all that. You have to educate your users and sometimes also resolve some struggles or something. And also, of course, you have to build new things.
And Wes, how would you describe your role as open source maintainer?
Yeah, I also think it's a hybrid role. I myself think of it as a cross between a librarian and a cat herder. So partially, my job is to keep all of the information, the roadmap and the issue tracker, organized and orderly so that people can arrive and successfully make contributions to the project, while also making sure that all of the contributors and other maintainers are being productive and that the whole project as a whole is healthy and making good decisions and respecting its code of conduct and its governance principles and so forth.
And Evan, how would you describe your role as open source maintainer?
Yeah, I share pretty much the same. I think Gina and Wes made a lot of good metaphors that I completely agree with. I think in the beginning I was mostly just writing code, but as the community grows, you naturally have to deal more with coordinating efforts in the community, trying to make sure the community is a good one, is welcoming, and people know where to go to ask questions. And so a lot of community maintenance, but still a lot of code to write as well.
So a lot of code writing maybe, but also a lot of sort of managing people, managing the project, and being a kindergarten teacher of all the things. So I know all of you had very interesting journeys. How would you describe a typical journey from consumer to contributor to maintainer in open source? And Gina, let's start this one with you.
I think mine is probably a pretty typical one. So the way that I got heavily into open source was that back in 2012, I got myself a 3D printer, and it was sitting in my office producing noises, producing fumes, and I just wanted it out of my office again and still be able to monitor it remotely. So I had this itch that I needed to scratch. So I scratched it, wrote a piece of software to do all that for me, and ended up with an open source project on my hands because apparently a lot of people had the same itch and I just had scratched it for them.
And Evan, what was your journey from consumer to maintainer?
Man, it's almost the same again because I was also scratched my own itch. I was working on these very projects with very fast turnaround, and I was like, I want a very smooth framework that fits my mental model that I can feel productive with. So I essentially wrote my own, and turns out a lot of other people liked it too. So it kind of grew into this thing today.
So this is interesting. You start with the project that you care about, and then eventually the community comes and joins you, and it grows into a full-blown framework that people have conferences about. That's so cool. So in terms of, this is a very interesting question because I think people have arguments about this all the time, but what's the importance of non-code, contributions to your particular project? And Wes, I would like to start this with you.
Yeah, I mean, non-code contributions are extremely important, and I would say highly underrated. One of the things that I spend the most time doing as a contributor and a maintainer is gardening the issue tracker. So organizing the reports that come in, getting more information from the issue reporters, closing out duplicates, connecting issues together, setting their metadata. Because ultimately, a project that is well organized and where we have as much information as possible about the bug reports or the feature requests that come in is going to make it that much easier for people to jump in and make contributions. And very little of that process, results in pull requests or commits landing in the main branch. So it's very, very important.
And Evan, in terms of non-code contributions to Vue.js, what do you think?
Oh, definitely. Non-code contributions, I would say, are equally critical compared to code contributions. Like documentation is very important. The thing is that when you contribute to documentation, it ends up being this shared knowledge that benefits everyone that comes after you. And also community engagement, say event organizers, meetup organizers, conference organizers, they also do a great service to the community by connecting people together. So I think, like these type of contributions are quite important in terms of where Vue is at today.
As a conference organizer, I'm really happy to hear that. But Gina, in terms of non-code contributions to your project, what are your thoughts on that?
I think contributions like that are utterly crucial, especially for projects like mine, like OctoPrint, who are more end-user facing, because the problem we face, I think, in general as maintainers, is that we have this very, very strict point of view on our code, which is very technical in nature with the architecture and all the details, all the technical details in our head, and this pretty much disqualifies us from writing good end-user facing documentation, whereas your regular run-of-the-mill user who does not even necessarily know how to write code is absolutely predestined to be able to help here. And it would be wonderful if more people found the courage to actually do that. And so I really welcome non-code contributions in my open source projects all the time. I love it when it happens.
So actually, newbies have a very important role to play in writing code documentation, is what I'm hearing. And that is super encouraging. And again, I would encourage anybody who wants to start contributing to open source to start with the docs, because I think this is a very easy way to get started. And Kath, actually, our host for today, actually just went through the journey of open sourcing GitHub docs, which enables the whole community to collaborate with us on that work, for helping everybody. So in terms of your community, have you ever experienced anyone becoming toxic to the community? And what do you do if that happens? Gina, let's start with you.
Sadly, I have. And my usual approach in cases like that is to first and foremost tell them when they are crossing certain kind of boundaries and are becoming toxic. So, for example, when they start calling people names or just are starting to show some kind of attitude that is not, let's say, not productive to the whole discussion and all that. And usually simply telling them that they are crossing a boundary here and are doing something that is not welcome will either make them go away or make them apologize and become a good citizen. Of course, that is not always the case, but at least so far my experience with this approach has been fairly good.
And Evan, how do you deal with toxic people?
Yeah, I think there are two types of toxic cases. I think, like, for example, one type is some random user just being really rude in a GitHub issue or a pull request, and in those cases, I mean, I kind of gotten used to it. If they repeatedly do this, we'll just block them thanks to the block feature. But if this is some more a public incident where a lot of people are getting exposed to, then we'll have to essentially investigate it and enforce the code of conduct very strictly.
And Wes, what about you in terms of toxic members of community?
I've been lucky to not have to deal with it too often, but in the handful of instances, I think it's very important to bring people back to your code of conduct and what we deem to be good behavior in the project, to say very firmly, like, we don't do that here. But I think it's also important to understand some of the what causes the toxic behavior. Sometimes it's somebody is really frustrated or has been, is frustrated by something in the project and they're just not dealing with it in the right way. So I think it's also helpful to empathize with the toxic actor and say, look, I understand that you're upset about this thing or you're upset about something, but this is not the way to deal with it. And like, we're all working here with good intentions, and like, let's work together to solve the problem. We don't need to call each other names.
I read it recently somewhere about like toxic behavior is about setting boundaries, right? So it's not just about the toxic person being toxic. It's also about you telling them this behavior is not accepted here. So I feel like we all know the answer to this question, but have you ever experienced burnout? And what's your strategy to deal with that? And Wes, let's get us started.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have, having been involved in open source for over 10 years now. I mean, I think it ultimately is comes from your desire, like my desire and other people's desire to make an impact. So you care so much about this project and this community that you're involved with that it's inevitable that that there will end up being more work than you can personally handle. And so rather than choosing, what you're successful at, it feels like you're choosing, what you're going to fail at. And so. And you're also exposed to a lot of negative, one-sided negative feedback about the project, bug reports and performance regressions, and people being frustrated about different things. And so, it's important to remind yourself that project can't succeed or fail on the basis of the efforts of one person. And so you have to, forgive yourself and make some space and make sure you're taking care of yourself mentally and physically, and trust that the community will. That will step in to do what needs to be done. Take care of the most important parts of the project.
Reducing the bus factor, right? Evan, what about you in terms of managing burnout?
Yeah, I've definitely been through phases where I seriously question why am I doing this, but I think a lot of the stress comes from just this constant influx of problems that people are telling you with, and where maintainers are like exposed or like majorly to these negative information. So I think one of the tricks I did is I essentially started pulling instead of being pushed these information. So I try to have a pretty strict work hours, only look at emails when I want to, only look at issues when I want to, instead of whenever an issue comes in, I'm going to rush to solve it. That's just not sustainable. It's also totally fine to just take some time off to recharge. I think sometimes I just don't feel like working. I'll just take a week off. That's the good part about working for yourself.
I feel like, especially for people who manage to be full-time open source maintainers, it sort of becomes the same thing as managing your full-time job, right? Remember to take vacations as well. I don't think that you always have to be available whenever someone has a problem. Gina, I happen to know your answer to this question, but what do you do to manage burnout?
Yeah, I mean, in my case, it pretty much boils down to what Evan already also said about very strict work-life balance and very strict working hours. But I also do have a punching bag in my office. And that also helps a lot when everything just becomes too much and I need to let off some steam. And in general, I think being a maintainer is it's a long-term commitment, right? And we want to do our job well for a long time. So I think it's really, really important that we also make it part of our job to take good care of ourselves, because probably no one else will. And that means obviously also taking vacations, allowing ourselves sick days off and all that. So yeah, just basically full agreement to everything that's already been said.
So I think after watching this stream, it may be that a lot of people are going to buy punching bags and install them in their offices right now, especially with all the virtual stuff going on and where you can't actually vent to real human beings around you. So I got another question, which is, how can the community help you manage work hours, help you manage burnout, and help you kind of have positive experiences around your open source project? And Gina, let's start with you.
Evan already gave an example of this, that we usually primarily see the negative things and only hear the negative stuff. And this is also something that I observe with OctoPrint. There's this huge silent majority that is completely happy apparently with what I'm doing. And then there's this very vocal minority that whenever something breaks or they have a problem, they become very loud and scream at me. If the silent majority became a little bit less silent and just from time to time thanked their maintainers, I think that would go a long way with regards to sustainable maintenance for everyone. I know that a thank you tweet usually makes my day, if not my whole week. So
that is awesome. And Evan, what about you in terms of people helping you manage burnout and other things?
I think the most validating moments were actually at offline events. So before the pandemic, we had quite a few offline conferences, Vue conferences that I went to personally. And at the after parties, people would actually come up to me and say thank you in person. I think those are the moments where I felt like this is totally worth it. All the work paid off. Unfortunately, we can't do this anymore. At least for now, but I really hope we can, get a chance to do that more in the future.
So it sounds like we have navigated into virtual world and created some alternative to that experience. So kind of like tweets and positive messages, right? I say, let's send your favorite open source maintainer a holiday card or some money via GitHub sponsors. You're all encouraged to do that. So important question, sort of a good segue into that. And how did your project actually figure out monetization? So Gina, let's start with you.
I'm actually not sure if I really have figured it out, or if there is anything specific to figure out, right? Because there is no code to crack or something like that. In my case, it was I had to somehow find a way to continue to work on OctoPrint full time, and so I tried crowdfunding. It worked in my case, at least so far, but it could also just as well not have worked. And I sometimes get questions from people who also try to do that, like if I have any tips for them, and I usually just shrug my shoulders because I don't know. I think there is no real do this and then you will have success kind of recipe there. It's just, hoping for the best.
Yeah, I think everyone on this panel was able to take open source as full-time job, which is I think many people are striving for. And what about you in terms of monetization?
So first of all, I think every project is different in terms of monetization. It's like 1,000 open source projects is like 1,000 startups with completely different business models. So you kind of have to think of, if you want to monetize the project, you kind of have to think about it from a product perspective. What are the values people are getting out of it, and how can you sort of funnel that back into the project? So specifically for Vue, it's simply because we have so many users that we figure out. I'm mostly doing crowdfunding as well, and because Vue is a pretty high exposure project, but that might not work for certain types of projects. So that, as Gina said, there is really no universal code that applies to everything.
Unfortunately, right? But we're trying to figure out. So Wes, what about you in terms of figuring out monetization for your favorite projects? Oops, Wes. It looks like Wes is muted. Wes.
I apologize. All right. I had some construction in the background. In the past, I've relied on working on open source projects as part of my job. But in recent times, I've been fortunate to have corporate industry sponsorships. And for me, it's really been about articulating that it makes sense to fund the development because they're investing in the ecosystems that they depend on and enabling the contributors and maintainers to do their best work.
And I think so. Again, and we announced the corporate sponsors, GitHub corporate sponsors at this conference, and I hope that this is going to be really helpful because now enterprise companies can support open source maintainers for projects that they rely on through their existing billing relationships with GitHub, which should make it a lot easier in certain cases. I guess we are coming up on talking about the important part of this conversation, which is trying to predict the future. So what do you all think in terms of what do we have to look forward to in open source for the next few years? And what is the most important part about the open source future? And Wes, let's get started with you.
Yeah, well, my perspective is that a lot of the innovation that's occurred over the last 10 years has been the result of basically superheroics from like a very small number of relatively small number of volunteers, and so the next stage of innovation in open source is going to require a lot more effort and a lot more people and a lot more funding. And so if we want to enable the ecosystem to continue to innovate, it's going to require significantly more funding, in particular, enabling more people to work full time on open source projects to make their work more sustainable, to have less contributor and maintainer burnout. So I'm hopeful that we can. I think there's been progress on solving some of these problems. I hope to see greater government level funding for open source to enable more and more people to make open source their career.
And I think I will plug in with something that we've had a lot of discussions about in the last few days, which is like open source is open source. It's not necessarily free, right? We still have people working on open source, contributing to it every day, and those people got to eat something, and these people got to get funded. And so just being entitled, like acting entitled to have all the open source software in the world for free doesn't really help the maintainers. Evan, what about you? What do you envision for the future of open source?
Yeah, I think a trend in the recent years is you see the rise of a lot of these projects that's mainly driven by individuals or small teams instead of these traditionally enterprise-sponsored kind of huge projects, even cross-company collaborations. And the importance of these small individual projects are becoming more prominent, but at the same time, we haven't really figured out the monetization and sustainability of this type of projects. And I think one important aspect for that is the financial infrastructure to make it easier for individuals to just fund their OSS, which, this kind of resource big companies have access to, but individuals, it's a hurdle that they have to jump over themselves. And if we can have, a financial infrastructure that just, reduces the friction for people to do this kind of stuff, I think it'll help a lot in the future. Like efforts like Open Collective and GitHub sponsors, I think are good efforts in this direction.
Awesome. And Gina, what about you in terms of future of open source?
Yeah, I'm pretty much agreeing with both of you. The thing is, in my opinion, sponsoring or donating to open source for users, not for companies, but for users, is still very, very even more niche than for companies. Let's say it like that. If you, for example, look at people like YouTube or Twitch streamers, it's way more normalized by now to sponsor those people for adding value to people's lives. And what I would really like to see within the next 5 to 10 years is, some kind of community shift also happening in that regard, that this becomes also more normal in the open source community. Because like Evan said, we have way more small projects that add a lot of value, but are helmed by only a very, very small amount of people. And those people, like you said, Sasha, do have to eat. So it would be really great if, in 5 or 10 years, when we meet again, we can say, hey, that worked out.
Yeah, so I think that there's a similar vein coming from everybody, and that is that we could have all the innovation in the world powered by millions of people collaborating on things, right? But we do have to figure out the way to fund this community effort as well, to enable people to essentially keep doing the good work. So we're coming up on time, and for closing, I would like to just ask you, each one of you, to say, how would you encourage your community to better support their open source maintainers today? And let's start with Wes.
Yeah, I mean, one small thing you can do is to talk to your managers about how you can allocate budget to support open source projects. It could be something like larger budget items, like larger sponsorships, or even something so simple as every engineer having a monthly allowance for GitHub sponsors, so you can choose which projects you want to sponsor.
And Evan.
Yeah, I would really recommend anyone interested in this topic read this book by Nadia Engbao. It's called Working in Public, and it talks a lot about this rise of small-scale open source projects that I was talking about, and I think it touches on a lot of good points.
Thank you. And I happen to know that our host just got this book, so I guess everybody's going to be reading the same book over the holidays. And Gina, in terms of supporting your open source maintainers, how can the community help?
I would just like to reiterate that every kind of contribution is valuable. Don't think that just because you cannot code or don't yet know how to code, you cannot contribute to an open source project. Your point of view is valuable, and we want to have it.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for being with us today. This was a tremendous panel. As a reminder, we're all going to be in discussions, answering questions for the next half an hour. And you can also read more about it in GitHub README project. And please find our maintainers on Twitter, on GitHub, and send them a holiday card and send them a thank you note for doing all the good work. Thank you.